Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Evidence Behind Better Philanthropy exclusive preview hosted by Tanoto Foundation, ABC, and CEI. To get things going, I'm going to introduce Esther from ABC to open with some welcome remarks. Over to you, Esther.
Thanks, Elim. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really nice to see so many of you here this afternoon. At APC, Asian Philanthropy Circle, we believe there's a real power in us coming together. Our mission is to mobilize Asian philanthropists to collaborate for greater impact. Because the saying goes, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Together, our members are helping to build thriving communities, supporting a resilient planet, and strengthening the philanthropic ecosystem across Asia. So indeed, it is so wonderful to see such a mix of people here today, our members, their teams, partners from the sector, and of course, the contributors to the study that we're discussing. Thank you for taking the time. MEL, monitoring, evaluation, and learning, is something that consistently come up across our community. Whether you're giving as an individual, running a foundation, or managing large grants, everyone wants to know how peers approach MEL and what we can take back to strengthen our own work. That's why today's session is so valuable. A big thank you to the Tanoto Foundation and CEI for sharing this study with us first. Philanthropy in Asia is vibrant, but still young. And how we approach MEL will shape how effective and collaborative our giving becomes. So I hope you'll find this discussion both practical and inspiring, and I invite you to engage openly in the exchange. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Esther, for those remarks. And now I'd like to welcome Benny Lee, CEO of Tanoto Foundation, to open with a few words as well before we head into the actual discussion itself.
Thank you, Elim, and thank you, Esther, for the remarks. Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome. It's wonderful to see over 200 of us gathered here today. The large turnout speaks volumes about the importance of today's topic. At Tanoto Foundation, we believe that doing good must also mean doing better. That is why measurement, evaluation, and learning, or MEL, is so important right now. Philanthropy is becoming more ambitious, more interconnected, and more complex than ever before. Good intentions alone are not enough. We also need evidence so that we can learn, adapt, and keep evolving in the way we serve communities. In other words, we need to know how we can do good better. Today's webinar is a preview of a global benchmarking study that Tanoto Foundation and CEI embarked on a year ago. The study looks at how some of the world's leading philanthropic organizations approach MEL. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the 11 foundations who participated in the study for their time and insights, which contributed greatly to our report. This study is meant to be practical. We hope it can be useful to help all of us strengthen our own MEL practice. In the months ahead, Tanoto Foundation will also be sharing short practice briefs to highlight how these ideas can come alive in real context. Our hope is that this study, together with ongoing conversations, starting with today's, can spark more exchange of ideas in this very important topic. I look forward to a rich discussion with all of you today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Benny, for those words. I'm sure everyone's eager to get straight into the discussion. So I'm going to invite Mary Abdo from CEI to come on and give us a bit of an overview of the report itself, and then introduce the speakers as well. So over to you, Mary. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Elim. Thanks, everyone, for having us today and for joining this. I too am really pleased to see the number of folks that we have online today and think this is a topic that we certainly in our work hear a lot of interest in. I'll quickly introduce some of the findings of the study, and then our plan is to have a panel today, which includes some of the study participants, some of the interviewees from the study, as well as a set of other organizations that are joining us today. And we'll plan on having a panel discussion and then an opportunity for the audience to ask some questions. So please do pop those into the chat. So let us dive right in. It would be great to move to the next slide on sort of why did Tanoto Foundation and CEI come up with the idea of doing this study in the first place? And this comes from an understanding that both organizations have, both Tanoto Foundation in its work as both an operating and a grant-giving foundation, and CEI in our work as a global nonprofit looking at getting evidence taken up in policy and practice. Looking at this issue of philanthropic practice, that generally philanthropic practice isn't well studied. In fact, some recent research that CEI has done really underscores this across different aspects of philanthropic practice. There aren't good places to, or there are too few places to learn how to do philanthropy. And we certainly encounter a lot of curiosity and interest across philanthropic institutions about how to do philanthropy better. And in particular, the effective use of evidence is a crucial but underexplored area. And in looking into this area, we might be able to support philanthropic institutions in their journey to be more effective in how they are deploying their resources. We also know how precious philanthropic capital is, and if we're able to help that be used in more effective ways, that's very mission aligned for both Tanoto Foundation and CEI. So this study comes out of that foundation and is really intended as a public good for the sector. We took this study on last year and together undertook the research, had an opportunity to benchmark these 11 institutions, and after a pretty significant long listing process, shortlisted those we thought would be interesting exemplars representing a variety of different organizational stages, geographies, and focus areas. And the real question we were asking is, how do leading global foundations leverage evidence from their monitoring, evaluation, and learning to drive foundation learning and advance mission? So there's really looking at this philanthropic practice question. And the objective of the study is to advance impact through the better use of better evidence. So let's move on and find out what we found. Just to flash up very quickly before we actually get into this, a big thank you to our participating foundations, many of whom are here today joining us either on the panel or in the audience. Jacobs Foundation, I unfortunately won't be able to introduce each of them in detail, but just to highlight Jacobs Foundation, Central Square Foundation, Lego Foundation, Co-Impact, Gates Foundation through their India team, Children's Investment Fund Foundation, you may not know her in Brazil, Bulago Foundation based out of California, Yayasan Hassana out of Malaysia, Van Leer Foundation, who are out of the Netherlands, and Porticus Foundation, again, out of the Netherlands, all participated in this study. Porticus Foundation are global, as are many of the other institutions I mentioned. So apologies for not being able to introduce each of you fully, but thank you very much. You can see a wide range of institutions participated. And let us move on to some of the details. So there are 10 findings. I will zip through these, and then we will have an opportunity to review some of them in the panel itself. So the first, and I think most striking thing that we came across in all the institutions is this notion of, perhaps we could find a better acronym over time, but SMEL. It's not MEL, it's SMEL. And that's really looking at strategy, monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So thinking about MEL work as being really deeply informed by and deeply informing the most critical strategic questions that institutions have. This is not a bolt-on, it's not an audit function. This is deeply woven into how foundations understand how they are doing work, what they choose to invest in, and how they think about continuing to track those investments. And what this implies in practice, and you'll hear this described by our foundation panelists, is that evidence teams are really deeply integrated with how strategy is working and with the work of those strategy teams. They're often one and the same team. And one of the groups that we talked to said that the MEL team holds the pen first on their strategy when they do their strategy work each year. A second theme that came up really strongly, and the word critical friend was raised many, many times in the interviews we had, that MEL teams work closely and collaboratively with stakeholders. These are trusted relationships. MEL teams are entering in a spirit of collaboration and support, often throughout the life cycle of work that program teams are doing. And when those collaborations are effective, it's when there's learning on both sides and they're seen as parts of a partnership. So we're friends, we work as partners. You can see this quote, and we have empathy. We want our program team to succeed. But at the same time, we pressure test that we debate, we question. So that is definitely this critical friend role. Also, one of the questions we had coming into the study, which was particularly of interest to Tanoto Foundation at that time, was looking at what kind of methods are these organizations using? Are they particularly attached to certain kinds of methods, or what are we seeing? What we found was that methodological flexibility was foundational to most of the organizations we talked to, really looking at a fit for purpose mindset and thinking about the most rigorous methods that could be applied given available time, resources, and the questions at hand. That was really the fundamental thing, is what question do we want to answer, and therefore what approaches will we have to answer it. And that matching the question to the method was really the most important thing. While there was a desire to use the most rigorous methods that one could, given the time and resources available, there wasn't an attachment to any particular approach. Also, this question about utility of evidence. So the view was evidence needs to be useful and used. MEL usefulness is tied to its ability to support decision making. So that implies speed, relevance, timeliness, communicability of findings all really underpinned how groups saw effective MEL. We can move to the next slide. A next foundational piece is around learning culture, and I think we'll go back to this again during the panel, is that this idea of a learning orientation of an organization and the idea of, this is actually described at length in the report, which you will have an opportunity to see after this session, once it is launched, I believe, next week. That this is very foundational, is the idea of failure or perceived failure as an opportunity for learning, that there's a high tolerance for risk among these institutions, and working with uncertainty and ambiguity. So understanding that what we do at what foundations are doing is often very catalytic, is often very frontier, may be about innovation, and is about experimenting in different contexts, perhaps with known interventions where we're looking at contextual fit. And so looking at embracing learning as part of that accelerates the impact that MEL is perceived to have. Also, we talked a little bit earlier about the strategic role that MEL has, and that implies also having a senior seat at the table. So not just a seat at the table, but a seat at the right table. Ensuring that MEL leaders have organizational authority. Often that means a direct tie into, they sit on leadership teams or have a direct tie to leadership teams. They are communicating with boards. That is something that was quite fundamental in the research that we did on these institutions. Also, that there is we're talking about often in foundations, we're looking at the supply side, quote unquote, as the capital is coming from the foundation. There's also a demand side need in terms of the evidence, and building that grantee evidence literacy is key to advancing impact. Many MEL institutions looked at co-owning MEL with grantees, often devolving decision-making to grantees about what kind of evaluation they were interested in doing, and ensuring that grantees had evidence literacy in order to create impact. This is a challenge that is observed across many geographies, is that historically the charitable sector is not necessarily a place where there is an abundance of places where one can learn about how to use evidence well. And so we're seeing a lot of foundations do work to upskill grantees and enable them to engage with evidence. Next page. Finally, into our last three, we do hear a lot in MEL about whether or not we think about contribution or attribution in evaluation. So really looking at, are we thinking about the fact that X happened because of us, and you can strip away all other factors? Can we say X intervention led to Y outcome? Or is it that we contributed to this? And we're not entirely sure. You can't put a numerical value necessarily on what we did, but we may be a part of contributing to an outcome. And what we heard for organizations, particularly where they were looking at systems change, is that they were focused really on their contribution rather than their attribution. So they said, really, this question of attribution, one group said the obsession with attribution needs to disappear. This is not something that we can focus on. It's more important that we think about how we contributed to a solution. We're seeing the emergence also of learning partners and learning partnerships as being certainly a key part of the work that we do at CEI, and is a key part of how many sector foundations are engaging with external teams, is thinking about longer term relationships with external partners who are helping sense make around evidence and be an external, again, playing a critical friend role outside of an institution, which understands some of what's going on inside. And finally, communications as a tool for impact. I know our panel would like to dig into this, but we talked about evidence being useful and used, really that knowledge translation component of evidence being really critical, and ensuring that our communications underpins our MEL objectives, that we're looking at ensuring that some of those often very crunchy scientific findings in evidence are making their way into how typical teams are interpreting and make sense of information. And that was something that was really underscored, whether it's policy teams or practice teams. And so now I'm really delighted to welcome a number of foundations who are within the APC network and or had contributed to the study. What I will do is just quickly introduce these groups. What we're looking for on the panel is to get a diversity of representation of institutions, and you'll see my colleagues on the panel join now. Diversity of representation of institutions, diversity of geographies, institutional size and type and function, to get lots of different perspectives on this panel. So we have representation from corporate foundations, global grant giving institutions, some folks who have operating functions, pass-through functions, and others who operate out of a family foundation context. So what I'll do is just very quickly introduce my fellow panelists, and then as you introduce yourself with our first, what I'll do is pose a first question, and as you prepare your response, if you could please also do a quick introduction to your institution, that would be very helpful. So I will start by introducing Dr. Akashi Kaul, who is the director of RMEAL, Research, Monitoring, Evaluation, and Learning. I think that stands for Akashi, at Central Square Foundation. Donika Domovska, who is the Chief Knowledge Officer at Jacobs Foundation. Sumit Joshi, who is Global Director at Lorinet Foundation. And last but not least, Morny Leo, who is Head of Measurement, Learning, and Evaluation at Tanoto Foundation. So let us just dive into our first question. And as I indicated earlier, we'll go for about a half an hour with our panel, and then we'll pivot to doing some audience questions. So I will keep us to time. What that means is I've asked my panelists in advance to be pithy in their responses, and I hope not to cut anyone off, but I might have to do that and be mean. So we'll see. So I'm just going to throw out our first question, which is around how does evidence help you meet your objectives and make change? So how do you think about evidence within the context of your institution? And I'm going to start with Morny there.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Murni, head of MLE at Tanoto Foundation. So Tanoto Foundation is the global family philanthropy foundation that aims to improve lives by investing in education and health initiatives. So in doing our work, we believe in impact first and evidence-based, which make the work of MLE very central in the organization. Back to your questions about, how we use evidence. I think at the foundation, we look at two things, right? We look at evidence in two ways. One is about making every dollar impactful. So we always say that philanthropy resources is limited, right? And how do you actually make a sensible and logical investment out of so many choices that's presented to you? So data provides us with the confidence to invest and reduce our risk. Just for example, during COVID, the foundation actually implement parent engagement programs, equip parents with the basic skill to help their children's learning at home. And from our data, conclusively it tells that parent engagement is a very powerful, effective levers to promote learning. And if you see today, our basic education program, our early childhood program have a parent component in it. But you also see in the other spectrum, the foundation also supported one or two pilots that do not get to scale because the result is not promising. So data is sort of like a compass for us to set the direction so that to know where we are going. The second point is about mobilizing action and resources responsibly. In the past few years, the foundation has transformed from applying a very simple model of philanthropy, working with the community one school at a time, to addressing a more complex issue like stunting and also helping our government partner to scale proven programs. And in the case of that, right, the MLE become very complex. And the purpose of MLE has also changed, right, from telling us where we are and where we want to go to informing policies, right, to helping our government scale and create a sustainable change. But overall, evidence actually help us to bring a better solutions to our community, help us to reach them faster and reach more community and in a more cost-effective way.
Thank you so much, Moni. That's a great way of starting us off. And I know that Tanoto Foundation does both operating and grant giving work. So it's giving us a real overview of how you might consider evidence within the context of your institution. I'd love to pivot to Donica at Jacobs, who brings a different lens on this. Over to you, Donica.
Hello, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I'm Danica Dymowska, Chief Knowledge Officer at the Jacobs Foundation, and we're a global foundation based in Zurich, Switzerland, working on getting evidence into policy and practice for teaching and learning so that we can improve the lives of kids globally. So thanks for that, and great to hear Morney's remarks as well. I would fully agree. I think, first of all, I wanted to start by saying that I think at this point in time, we believe that philanthropy is under pressure quite a bit, given that both bilaterals and countries in many places around the world are reducing their investment in education, which is very concerning. And we're looking at evidence from our perspective, which we've always done over the history of the foundation of 35 years now, as really a tool for impact, with the notion that evidence actually, if we were to use evidence more effectively in designing policies, in implementing teaching and learning practices, we will achieve better outcomes for children. So that's at the heart of a fundamental kind of belief that we hold, and science being at the core of the work that we do. In addition to that, we as funders are kind of making decisions across very different contexts. So we work both in Switzerland, very high income setting, but also in lower and mid income countries such as Colombia, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire. So across these different settings, we wanted to introduce kind of a more unified framework for how to think about evidence. And this is with the goal of making sure that we're not introducing bias, personal preference, or making the loudest voices in a room in different settings really be the ones that kind of make the final decisions, while not acknowledging the context, introducing contextual variability in terms of how decisions are made. But we wanted to create some degree of uniformity at the governance level and the way in which we make grants and how we operate. So created our own evidence framework. In fact, CEI and Mary were involved in that process. And we wanted to make sure that we not only look at effectiveness and what works and what doesn't, but we also look at the culture of evidence. What is evidence, and how do you actually introduce it as part of your cultural makeup of an institution? So we apply that to ourselves, but we also apply that to the partners and grantees that we work with. And we look at things like, do you prioritize continuous learning? What does that look like within your institution? Do you allocate the resources? Do you have a budget for that? Do you have a team with the skills and competencies to execute on it? It's not enough to actually say, yes, it matters, but does it travel through the entire pathway that you use for the work that you do? And does it matter at both the board level and also in the way that your team allocates time and they're incentivized to use evidence in their work? And one thing I wanted to highlight as well is that evidence for us means that we can actually be better at failure, be better at understanding what's not working. And what we found too is that if you don't intentionally embed learning and evidence in your process, you will fail poorly. So we wanted to fail intelligently. And what does that actually mean? That means that you create rapid cycle reviews, you create learning checks, you have moments in time when you actually do assess the signals of change. What is it that's actually happening, even if you don't have enough evidence to determine ultimate impact? So really embedding those kinds of things into the decision-making process allows it to kind of live and breathe that culture of evidence. And a final thing I'll say is that we as philanthropies, and actually there was a recent article in SSIR on this topic, is that we rarely use disconfirming evidence or evidence that actually tells us something that is not what we want to hear. And because of the way that the power dynamics work in our sector, especially, it is really critically important that we do that. And that is how we believe you can do better work and improve the work of your partners as well. And I'll pause there. Thank you, Mary.
I love both of what you and Morny have said about the use of evidence to make decisions, and particularly to look at where things didn't work out the way that you expected. And this highlighting of that piece about disconfirming evidence has certainly made the rounds within our institution as well. So it's a great piece. Akashi, would love to hear more from you about how these themes might be playing out within your institution.
Hi, thanks for that, Mary, and thanks for your opening remarks, Marnie and Donica. Lots to think about over there. I'm Akashi Kaul, and like Mary mentioned, I lead ARMY, where the A actually stands for assessments, at the Central Square Foundation. The Central Square Foundation is an India-based philanthropy focused entirely on education. We used to be a grant-making organization solely earlier, but we have transitioned now to direct operations. And a large part of that is because of evidence and how evidence has helped us understand that, grant making is great, but it removes the locus of control from you to outside of you, wherein it gets a little bit difficult and murky to figure out what kind of evidence is needed, where, how, when, etc. And also the second piece we realized was that for the kind of change that we were hoping to make, nothing short of system reforms, reforming the entire system, working with the government to reform the entire system would work for us. And when we had that realization based on evidence, which sort of gets at, how does evidence help our organization meet our objectives, we shifted and we transitioned to working in system reform. So for us, evidence has always had a very important seat on the table. It is what sort of determines whether we continue on a course of action or we shift gears like we did with how we spend the money that we have. And what we sort of have now realized and settled into this happy middle of understanding that learning from our previous experiences where small scale pilots or programs helped us understand whether something works in a certain situation before we take it to scale. So there's a heavy evidence dependence on things like pilots for us, right? But at the same time, realizing that just because something piloted well or worked really well at a small scale doesn't mean it'll scale well. Doesn't mean that it will work really well at a system reform level. There are so many hurdles leading, starting from advocacy to implementation fidelity to operational challenges. They're just the layers of challenges get so many that just scaling, the act of scaling a pilot requires you to reframe and rethink your MEL structures. And that's exactly the space that CSF is in, wherein we're invested in seeing proof of concept for an idea at a pilot level, and that requires a different kind of evidence, but recognizing that when we go to scale, we will need to change that evidence structure almost entirely. And I saw, I was just browsing through the question answer box we have on here, and there was already a question around attribution. And when we do at scale work, attribution is nearly impossible to ascertain, right? Because there's so many factors, there's so many players, particularly in a saturated environment like India, where we have so many civil society actors also simultaneously acting on the same problem. To determine whether any change can be attributed entirely to you is a near impossible task. So sort of letting go of that obsession with attribution was a huge step for us because evidence has been sort of siloed into that RCT, quasi-experimental sort of space, and moving away from that for us was a way for us for meeting our objectives. A thing that Donica said that really sort of resonated with me right now was sort of learning from our failures. I mean, I'm going to call it what it is, right? When evidence tells you what you don't want to hear, it's probably telling you that you failed. So, and you know, Carol Weiss wrote on this in the 80s, I believe, The Power of Failure and Learning from Your Failures, and sort of publishing your failures so that other actors in the ecosystem or the civil society don't go on and repeat the same mistakes that you made. Otherwise, we'd just be a whole ecosystem of people doing the same thing without realizing that somebody else has already done it and you know it hasn't really produced the kind of results that you want. So while I will not say that any programmatic team takes very kindly to being told that what they're doing is not working well or you know, that it's not working at all. At CSF, we have embraced the culture of, you know, sort of the language of, oh, maybe we can try it differently, you know, or, you know, maybe if we tweak it like here or tweak it a little bit there, maybe this is not the best investment of our time or our people or our money. So, you know, just tweaking the language and making it more about learning rather than passing a judgment has really helped us incorporate things that we learn from our studies that point to things that are not working. So shifting that gear and moving that lens of accountability and judgment to learning has also really sort of helped us move a little bit towards meeting our objectives.
I would say that's a very, very strong theme. Thanks, Akashi. That's it's a strong theme that came out certainly in the research and is a strong theme from the institutions I see gathered here is that focus. And instead of saying, even the conception of kind of success or failure, it's not as though institutions are setting out to do something that doesn't work. As a person smarter than me once said, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. And so we just pivot, we learn, we pivot, we do something new when we learn that what we're doing is not working. And now over to Sumit, would love to hear about learning within the context of the work that you do at Lorinet.
Thank you, Mary. I want to start by acknowledging that, unlike many of my fellow panelists, our lens comes less from technical ML expertise and more from applying evidence in contexts like Mongolia, where the philanthropic ecosystem is still nascent. So Lorinet Foundation is a family foundation, and we focus on early education and youth employment for vulnerable communities in Mongolia and Southeast Asia. To understand how evidence shapes our work, it will perhaps help to first grasp Mongolia's unique context. So the country is vast, roughly the size of Western Europe, but with just 3.4 million people. That's perhaps a single neighborhood here in New Delhi. And but out of this 3.4 million, nearly half of this population lives in the capital city, Ulaanbaatar. And around 60% of the city's residents live in gairs. And these are traditional tent-like dwellings where people face significant socioeconomic challenges, harsh winters, remote communities, and still prevailing nomadic traditions. These all create real barriers to basic infrastructure, education, and employment. At the same time, Mongolia's entire philanthropic ecosystem, as I said, is still young. So identifying reliable implementation partner is already quite challenging. So in this context, evidence has helped us in two ways. Firstly, it guides us to focus resources on areas of highest potential impact, and then design the interventions that are most relevant to the communities we serve. For example, before starting our programs, we commissioned need assessments, thematic landscape studies, which all pointed us towards critical leverage points, such as, in our case, expanding access to early childhood programs, working with the relationships around children, not just children, but the relationships with parents and caregivers, improving the learning environments, strengthening the workforce capacity, and then supporting the youth employment initiatives and the enabling ecosystem. So today, after a few grant cycles are over, we draw on the global interventions to bring to Mongolia. Secondly, evidence also helps us to partner effectively. By grounding our approach in data and learning, we are able to not only test assumptions and adapt as we go, but also align with our grantees in the wider ecosystem more effectively. So a recent example I must share is our collaboration with UNICEF to launch Mongolia's first study on family-friendly workplace policies. This is going to be a very long program, but we wanted to have the baseline in place so that we understand the delta from today to when the program ends. So to conclude, when we developed our first impact report 3 years ago, we articulated a foundation-wide impact framework. So for the first time, actually, we could communicate clearly that our impact is guided by a dual focus, achieving direct outcomes on the ground on one hand, and contributing to systemic change on the other hand. So direct impact and systemic impact. And this unified framework, it now allows us to aggregate indicators more sharply and communicate results in a way that is, I think, both understandable and compelling. I'll pause here.
Thank you, Sumit. That is really, really interesting to hear how evidence is playing out in the life cycle of your organization and the context, the very unique context that you're working in. We're going to focus in on our next question is looking at what approaches and innovations the organizations here have adopted to help them keep MEL rigorous and useful in the context that they work in, which are very diverse. So we've got you're working all over the world, from sub-Saharan Africa to Southeast Asia to South Asia and to Mongolia, as we've just heard about. These are very diverse contexts. And so thinking about how we ensure that MEL is indeed both rigorous, but also that we're getting useful insights. So I'd love to turn to Morny. Certainly, if we talk about diversity, there's very few places that have as much of it as many of the geographies that you're working in Southeast Asia. So would love to have Morny start us off with this. And I'd like to remind our participants, we've got some great questions already showing up in the Q&A. We'll turn to those in about 10 minutes. And until then, would love to hear if you have any additional questions. So please do pop them in. So over to you, Morny.
Yeah, so really agree with the panelists here. Learn a lot from all of you, but I guess the foundation we also agree on, the role of leadership, right, and being intentional when it comes to learning and also building the capacity of the whole organization. But back to your questions about how do we contextualize innovations when it comes to MEL. So Tanoto Foundation's biggest operation is in Indonesia, and Indonesia is a huge country, and so is the issue and the problems, right? And we are very diverse, which actually also add to the complexity of the context that we work in. But I guess, the measurement a good measurement should start from a good program design, right? So when we look at the program design, it also has to be representative, and the intervention has to be applicable to the context that we work in. So for Indonesia, for example, right, we want to ensure that our program design is representative of the rural, urban, east, west, and central part of Indonesia. And in that sense, the evidence that we produce will also be useful. But sometimes you get to see that the intervention works in a certain context, but it doesn't work in a different context, right? So the evidence actually is telling us, right, what works here and what doesn't work there. Another trend that we see is growing, right? There's an increasing appetite from our government partners to invest more in evidence-based policy making. And it's kind of like open the doors for us, like Philanthropy, to come in and support our government partners to build the data monitoring and evaluation capability in the public institutions. And today, if you see, all of HECSIP programs has some component of the data monitoring, that helps the government to strengthen their data capability and do a better evidence-based policy making.
Oh, Morny, hearing that the policymakers are interested in evidence-based policies, I think it just made everybody on the panel feel very happy for a moment.
It's increasing. The trend is there.
I mean, it's wonderful to hear that you're hearing that from policy. But what I think is really interesting, and I'd love to have Akashi pick up this theme in her remarks, is the role that philanthropy we're observing play in supporting government in that technical assistance work, in getting policy to be evidence informed. That philanthropy has a real capacity to be catalytic, even in that role with government in terms of its use of evidence. So, would love to hear Akashi's reflections on this. I know you do a lot of work in that area, Akashi.
Yes, almost about 70% of our work is that sort of dance of negotiation, as I call it, between technical rigor and the minimal viable product for mill for systems that are large. So I mean, for us at CSF, since we do a large chunk of our work is system reform, it is entirely dependent on us being embedded within the government or as either technical support actors or as advocates for certain kinds of reforms at a policy level itself. A huge amount of our work is really dependent on being accepted by the government, and it has its trade-offs. Why I call it a dance of negotiation is because no system that a government creates, because it's for scale. And imagine the scale of India. I mean, Sumit just mentioned that the entire country of Mongolia is the size of a neighborhood in Delhi. So now double that, triple that, quadruple that, whatever it is, to the entire size of the country. And then imagine the scale of a system that is required to track, say, learning level outcomes for even a small district. So that in no which way are any of those systems going to be perfect. And also the government has a mind of its own. They've been doing this work for a while. They clearly know quite a bit about how to do it, given that we have a proliferation of, at least physically, schools across the length and breadth of India at this point in time. And, in multiple languages, recognized languages and dialects and everything. So given the complexity of the large system itself, no system is going to be perfect. And this demand that we make of evidence to be perfect is quite then it's quite fantastical in that situation, right? Because if the system itself does not allow for perfection of that nature or rigor as defined by, methodological expertise, then how are we going to ever build a system that can be utilized? In order for a MEL system to be utilized, it has to be negotiated with what is available. It could be a resource constraint in terms of technology. It could be a resource constraint in terms of the human resources that you have available. It could be a resource constraint in terms of what geography you can and you cannot go to. It could also be a negotiation with the government about indicators. I mean, we think that measuring indicator X is important, but the government thinks measuring indicator Y is important. So how do you go into that conversation? You go into that conversation saying, we'll measure indicator Y, but can we also give you a tack on with indicator X, right? Because that's just how to get work done. There's also the construct of parking tickets, where there are tasks that the government deems important and just absolutely necessary for it to function, but may have little value when you come to think of them in terms of the larger applicability and utilization of that kinds of data. But you have to do it because the government really thinks that it's important for them to either put on their reports or to report out to whoever or however they need to collate it. So a large part of providing technical assistance and making sure that the bare minimum viable MEL product is available is also doing a lot of these add-on tasks and sort of looking at those parking tickets as being an important part of your job. So it's really just a dance of negotiation. And if you're really married to a methodological rigor singular construct of methodological rigor, I think it's going to get very difficult for you to produce evidence that's going to be utilized.
I think those themes of flexibility, and I love the conception of a dance as you're working with partners and the way that plans may play out in these different contexts. Certainly, we heard that from Morny in talking about the different and diverse contexts that she's working in. Donica, this came up a little bit in themes that we talked through. Can you talk a little bit about how these might play out, that balance between rigor and utility, and some of the work you're doing in local contexts?
Yeah, I mean, it is a thing that I think every philanthropy or every organization that works globally, but also works at the country level struggles with. I mean, we've struggled with it quite a bit. For context, we work both at the global level with programs that support fellowships for young researchers, but also work at the country level implementing very large scale teaching and learning programs with large co-funding mechanisms together with government and other philanthropies. So we have that dual challenge of what do we understand to be our global impact, but also how do we make sure that we also are embedded in the system and are achieving education outcomes that governments care about. So that is something that we grapple with a lot. I would say two things. I think we have often fallen prey to what I call the sense of false precision, where we kind of go and want to get down to the level of how many kids are benefiting. Again, going back to the attribution versus contribution, and want to get very precise in that understanding. And I think that's often the case with funders, where they want to, number of kids, what's your target? What has that resulted in? But where we miss the boat often is a more accurate understanding of the systemic change that you're enabling, which is very difficult to assess, right? So we either get into the false precision mode, or we say it's systems change, it's not measurable, it's difficult. So it's these two extremes that I often find are kind of common in philanthropy. So how do we get to a middle ground where you can say, yes, these are the outcomes that we really want to strive for? And those may be aligned with government objectives, oftentimes SDG objectives that they may have set for themselves, like SDG 4 in our case. But at the same time, how do we take account of the systemic mechanisms that you're putting in place? So just to give one example, one thing that we're doing builds on what Akashi and Morning have said is, how do you get governments to demand, which already exists, which is nice in many cases, but also to use evidence? And how do you translate relevant, timely evidence into policy and practice, right? Because in government decision-making processes, evidence, in a perfect world, there will be a perfect process, right? You understand what you want to learn, you go and gather information, then you make that part of your decision making. That's not reality, right? You have political issues, you have pressures, you have all kinds of other things that come into play. So what we've done is build in several places, even here in Switzerland, where you would think evidence is part of the process, it often isn't. We're building evidence labs, and these are government-facing policy labs that make it their job to be the clearinghouse, to look at what are we learning globally, what are we learning from the context, and triangulating that to inform policy and practice. And I think that's an example of something that we believe could be a model for countries, but also for our own internal MEL teams. How do you create these evidence labs in meaningful ways in order to make sure that you're not falling prey to that false precision issue, but also can think about how do we assess the systemic mechanisms and create innovative methods for it. I don't buy the argument that we don't have methods for those things. We just need to think differently about how to assess them. And that's something that we're looking at predictive modeling, predictive analytics, and ways of using information to inform what could happen in the future. So I'm quite excited to see some of these things coming into play as well.
Oh, brilliant. And over to Sumit for the last word before we go to our Q&A.
Yeah, I understand the time constraint as well, Mary, so I'll keep my response short. Building on what's been shared and particularly extending Donica's view, the key for us has been to ensure that evidence stays fit for purpose. In Mongolia, as I elucidated, both the philanthropic as well as the implementation ecosystems are still very young. So we have learned that chasing textbook definitions of rigor can actually paralyze action. So in our case, instead, we ask what level of monitoring and what indicators are credible enough to measure progress and guide a decision without overburdening partners or slowing momentum. So often this means starting with small scale pilots and rapid feedback loops. In fact, most of our programs deliberately structure year one as pilot to anchor the subsequent years and the phases. So while we are still developing a robust foundation level MEL, what has really helped is treating rigor less as a fixed standard and more as a balance between context, capacity, and the decision needs. So in Mongolia, we don't always have large data sets or multiple partners to benchmark against. So rather than forcing external definitions, we co-design the learning approaches with our grantees. When we ask together, what do we need to know to improve? What's realistic to measure now? So that co-ownership makes M&E more actionable, and it builds a culture of learning without overwhelming partners. So to conclude, the real innovation for us has been to stay disciplined about proportionality. In other words, to just right size evidence so that it remains both rigorous and genuinely useful.
Oh, that's such a great way of closing us out, Sumit, that focus on rigor and utility, that which I think that gets down to that dance that Akashi was talking about. We have so many good questions here, and I do want to suggest, given the volume of just really rich questions, I will pose something here, which I'd love to talk to my panelists, my fellow panelists about afterward, and potentially our hosts. Is the interest I've heard from some of the interviewees in having a community of practice for professionals in this space and doing more to bring together this dialogue afterward. There may be a possibility of us circulating some written responses from the panelists to some of these questions because they are so very rich. Probably one of the questions that we want to focus in on is looking at achieving or sharing a common point of view when interpreting evidence. So this is one where we've talked a lot about the process of producing evidence, but actually, how do you sense make together and Akashi, you talked a little bit about this before, but I am mindful of time. So maybe if you have some last words about how you might attack this question of how do we sense make across partnerships. And we'll start with you, Akashi, and then I'll move through the team.
So I'll give you a live example. We never actually put together a final quote unquote findings report till we have workshopped the evidence with all possible stakeholders. And that is, to me, till date, that has been the best way to come to a common understanding of what the evidence is saying. So if we have multiple partners for a project, we will invite them, we will have a workshop together, and only then would the final findings of the report be sort of put out as and implications discussed. Now, this requires a lot of pre-work from our end because you want to put evidence out in a format that is easily palatable by different kinds of stakeholders. So you can't just put out regression models and hope that people understand. That's not going to happen. So you have to really sort of break down the evidence in a palatable way, and then you introduce it in a workshop mode, and then you hear what people have to say about it, and you come to a common understanding of how this is going to be presented. That's a very short answer to a rather longer discussion.
I think that point about workshopping, sense making together, that it's really about putting our heads together in this, and that certainly those touch points came up a lot in the research, was particularly where groups are working with program teams, is kind of an ongoing dialogue internally that's had about the evidence that's coming out. I would love to jump to I'll give you the last word, Morny. So I'm going to jump to Donika and then Sumit and then to you Morny. Over to you, Donika.
Yeah, sure. Well, one thing that I will say is that which we haven't talked about today very much, maybe a community of practice can help unpack it, is everything that has to do with the non-technical side of things. So when you think about what is sense making and what are the skill sets that team needs, the technical piece is actually not the most critical one. It's the relationship building, the ability to understand what grappling with as a programs team or as a partner, as a government or as a grantee. The ability to listen, the ability to triangulate and understand different perspectives. That skill set is a very difficult one to find in someone who has both the technical piece, but also the ability to foster open discussion, conversation, facilitate well. So I would say you need people who can do those things really, really well to do sense making effectively. And that's the thing that I think is unique to this role and to the kind of people that get into it. So more people like that would make us better at what we do.
Well said. Thank you. Yes, I couldn't agree more. Sumit, what are your perspectives on this sense-making question?
Yeah, I think we are still a new foundation. So evidence generation, MEL, finding right indicators, I think all of this could be really overwhelming. So in our case, what really worked was to treat evidence as a parallel activity, not treat it as a parallel activity, but because it works only when it is embedded into the design and decision making from day one, not as an afterthought. So why I'm saying this is because if we are clear about what we are trying to learn and why, so having this clarity on the questions really ensured that that's why, the smell part, that it drives strategy, MEL, and not just data collection.
That's great. The idea of this being an embedded practice, I think, is really had been a very strong theme of the research, and certainly seems to be coming out in your remarks. And Morni, over to you. How would you interpret this question?
Yeah, I'm just going to build up from Akashi's and Sumit's point. So at the foundation, practically, we do reflection sessions, and we want to actually schedule this reflection session at two Windows points, right? The first one is when the project is over and there's the decisions to whether to extend, to continue the project or to stop it. And the second one is during the budget cycle, right? You want to do reflection, bring all the data to the team before they make decisions about, how much resources they're going to pour into the project. That's the first one, reflection sessions at the very critical points. And the second one is on Sumit points about bringing your partners early. So having a deep relationship with your external learning partners is really very critical. So in the past, we learned that they just come in during the baseline and then they go off and then they come in again during the end line. And we found that the report that they produced is very general, right? Even our team actually know more about that, right? So if you have a deep relationship with your partners, they can really give you like a very concrete recommendation. This is what you need to do. Just do this for you to increase your impact. And that's the kind of relationship that we want to have with our partners.
What a great note to close on, Morni. Here, those deep relationships that are focused on learning over time. I want to just close out today by thanking everyone for their contributions to this study. I'm aware we've got to time, so if you need to drop off, please do, but I'll be one more minute. What we found really, and I think this panel indicates, is that there's real appetite to learn about MEL practices. It was certainly something that it's come up numerous times afterward as an appetite to read this study. We've had, quite a strong response to this event. And as I said, this interest in potentially a community of practice for professionals in this space. So definitely an area that we'd like to pick up on. There are possibilities for common or collaborative solutions. And indeed, one of the questions I saw was about the potential for potentially sharing MEL approaches or resources across foundations, where there's an opportunity to create more public goods that foundations can benefit from, or more collaborative approaches between institutions. And that role of quote unquote failure is an important one that we've posited that this is something that we can learn from. Areas of methodological innovation, particularly in how we look at systems and measuring impact in systems, is something that came out quite strongly in the report. We did talk about attribution versus contribution, and that one came out as an opportunity for us to learn more. And we know that there's an opportunity to learn more about how to operationalize some of these MEL practices. We heard a lot today about how institutions are structured, how teams are structured, how these conversations can happen effectively. There's lots of good practice out there, and just ensuring that we're studying and sharing that together is something that can advance all of our work. I'd love to close with one of my favorite quotes that came out of this broader set of research, which is from our colleague, Dr. Sunita Krishnan at Gates Foundation India, who said that her greatest learning across all of her career in this work has been to stay really humble and stay really curious. That was the sort of working title of this report for some time. So I think these points about curiosity and humility have really come across from our panelists today. And I thank you very much for your contributions, either to the study or to the panel or to both. So thank you very much. And to our hosts at APC and Tanoto Foundation for your partnership and for the opportunity to work on this together.